When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Curly. User, Step 9T. Posted, July 21st, 1997.
Back when my grandparents were alive, one of their favorite things to do was have their kids and grandkids come over to their house and visit. I have so many fond memories of sitting around the big kitchen table in their farmhouse, eating coffee cake, and hearing my relatives tell stories about growing up. There were funny stories, like the one where my Uncle Pete was chased by chickens when he was 3, or sad ones like when the military men came to tell them Uncle Mike had been killed in Vietnam. But my favorites were the ghost stories. The story I remember most from those days was the one about Curly. Curly first came into our family's life when Dad was 3 and Grandma walked into his bedroom to find him talking to somebody. There wasn't anybody in there with him, but Dad was apparently happily chattering away. When Grandma asked him who he was talking to, he said, "Curly." Over the next little while, Curly started to come up more and more, so Dad's parents decided he must be Dad's imaginary friend. They asked what Curly looked like, and Dad explained he was tall, bald, and only had one arm. He also said he wore jumpers, which is what my dad called overalls, and old mucky boots. Curly never scared Dad, just kept him company, and from the sound of it, kept him safe. Supposedly, he'd tell Dad not to play in or near water and to always watch out for coyotes. I guess when he was that age, Dad'd call him Yodi, so everyone liked to rib him about that. Since there were no bodies of water anywhere nearby, Grandma and Grandpa took this as further evidence that Dad was making the whole thing up the way kids do and would grow out of it. He did, eventually, but it took a few years, and during that time, Curly was a constant topic of conversation. Dad says he doesn't have any real memory of this, just a vague impression of a very happy, fulfilled childhood. It wasn't until after Grandma and Grandpa passed that we learned the truth about Curly. We were getting ready to sell the farmhouse, and Dad had asked me to go to City Hall to collect some documents on the property. I got talking to a file clerk there who had just the most incredible recall for all the properties in Davis County. When I gave her the address for Grandma and Grandpa's house, she immediately knew where it was and mentioned it had once been 2 separate lots. I said that I hadn't known that, and she took me into the records room to show me the relevant paperwork. I guess the land next to Grandma and Grandpa's had been vacant for some time when they moved in and stayed that way until they worked up enough money to buy it. We were looking at the original deeds when I saw on the neighboring land what looked like a pond. I pointed it out to the clerk, who agreed with me. She said that it was Futterman's Slough and it had been drained around the turn of the century after a young girl drowned. I asked if there was any way to learn more, and she directed me to the public library, which had microfiche copies of the Pioneer record dating almost all the way back to the Civil War. After I finished my business at City Hall, I went straight to the library where Mrs. Marbach, the librarian, set me up with the microfilm machine and the relevant reels. It was on the third reel that I found it. A headline dated June 7th, 1898. Girl, 8, drowns. There were no pictures. I don't think newspapers had pictures back then, but it backed up everything the file clerk said and more. In a turn of events that has plunged our community into mourning, the life of 8-year-old Anthea Foster was cruelly snatched away in the shadowy depths of Futterman Slough yesterday afternoon. The daughter of esteemed blacksmith Curly Foster, Anthea met her untimely fate in a chilling encounter with the untamed wilderness that surrounds our tranquil township. Eyewitnesses of the tragedy recount a scene of terror as a pack of ravenous coyotes descended upon the unsuspecting child, driving her to flee in a frantic desperation toward the murky waters of the slough. With wild yelps and snarls echoing through the air, Anthea's father, Curly Foster, raced to her aid, his heart heavy with dread as he bore witness to the harrowing spectacle unfolding before him. In a display of unwavering bravery, Curly confronted the savage predators, his every sinew strained with the primal instinct to protect his beloved daughter. With righteous fury, he drove the beast back into the depths of the wilderness, but alas, his valiant efforts came too late to spare Anthea from the merciless clutches of the slough's chilling embrace. The entire township stands united in grief and disbelief at the loss of one so young and full of promise. Anthea Foster was a cherished member of our close-knit community, her laughter and boundless spirit lighting up the lives of all who knew her. So there it was. Curly wasn't just an imaginary friend, but a sort of guardian angel watching over my father. I felt a chill pass through me. This was real, actual proof that there's something more out there, something greater than us lives on after we die. I asked the librarian to show me how to print from the reader and drove home as fast as I could to show my dad. At first, he didn't believe it either, but then he went through the same thought process I did, and for the first time in my life, I saw him cry.
Subject: Dreaming of the Monster. User: RealAnonX74. Posted August 2nd, 1996.
A lot of people say that they'd love to be able to predict the future, but I speak from experience when I say ignorance is bliss. Now, I'm not psychic with the crystal ball and what have you, but I do have dreams that almost always come true. Not all my dreams are like this, you understand. Most of them are the garden variety nonsense you think of when you think of dreams. Familiar locations change slightly, people I vaguely remember from school acting out little plays that are obviously my brain sorting out my day. The dreams that predict things happen way less often, usually when something significant is happening to people I know or someone connected to them. The first example I can remember was dreaming about walking out the front doors of my hometown's courthouse and bumping into a woman named Lynn. Lynn isn't a friend of mine, but she used to work with my wife Corey, and we'd see each other from time to time at functions where spouses were expected to attend. I never felt one way or another about Lynn, which is why I was surprised to see her in what I knew immediately was a dream. Surprise is why we bumped into each other, which knocked loose a bundle of papers she was carrying. Dozens of loose sheets fluttered down to the stone steps, and I immediately apologized, starting to help her collect them. They say you can't read in dreams, but it's never been a problem for me. I won't say I've read whole books while asleep, but I've woken up with firm memories of signs or blocks of text and written them down in a journal in case they ever become useful later. Some of them have, but that's not the story I wanted to tell today. Back to the dream of Lynn and her scattered papers. As I collected the documents off the courthouse steps, I could see they had something to do with the sale of real estate. Lynn, who was in real life a pretty reserved person, was barely holding back tears as I handed the stack back to her. A moment later, I woke up. In the morning, when I told Corey about the dream, she frowned and said that Lynn hadn't been at work in a few days. My wife is a level-headed, no-nonsense business machine when she puts her mind to it, but she also knows the track record of my dreams and trusts them. When I picked her up from work later that day, she said she'd called Lynn and found out that she hadn't been into the office because she was dealing with the sale of her late father's house. As I understand it, she had been eager to keep it in the family, but one of her sisters is perpetually broke and forced the others to either buy her out or put the house on the market. Since Lynn and her siblings already had financial obligations, sale was the only option, and they were pretty broken up about it. Sometimes the dreams are about positive things. About 10 years ago, I dreamed that a woman I'd gone to college with, Susan, was shopping with her mom in the Bon. They were looking at little table and chair sets, bedding, fancy plates, things like that. When I mentioned the dream to Corey, she said they must have been making a gift registry for a wedding, which I hadn't clocked because that part of our wedding was well out of my hands. Sure enough, a month later at Kroger, I ran into Bobby, a mutual friend of mine and Susan's from the old days, and worked the conversation around to where everyone had ended up. Bingo! Susan had just gotten married in Seattle not 2 weeks before. See, it's not all bad stuff. It is, however, mostly bad stuff, and I leavened my story with Susan's wedding because the last dream I want to share is not pleasant. Where I work, we have a lot of middle managers, none of whom really do much aside from gumming things up for people who actually have jobs to do. One of those managers was named Derek, and I cannot possibly communicate how little I like that man. Derek was pretty, venal, and not nearly as smart as he thought he was, but that didn't stop him from making life miserable for anyone who happened to technically rank below him in the org chart. When I started having dreams about Derek being chased around the office by a monster, I was over the moon. I couldn't actually see what was chasing him, I just knew that I loved seeing him run, a look of terror on his usually smug face. As the days and then weeks passed, it got harder to enjoy the dreams because the monster started catching up with him, sometimes right in front of me, and it began to eat him. It started with just one bite on his ass, which was still pretty funny to be fair, but each successive dream became more and more gruesome. Pretty soon, it wasn't just a bite. The thing was eating him like a watermelon, but instead of spitting out seeds, tiny little chunks of bone would squirt into the cubicle walls, each with a soft little pop. Then, the dream stopped. One day, Derek wasn't at work. That single day's absence extended into a week, and everyone was celebrating the extended peace and quiet. The whispers started after he'd been gone a month, little rumors about him not coming back, but no one knew quite why. 3 months in, and our local manager called us into the conference room for an announcement. After 6 months of intensive treatment, Derek had passed from colorectal cancer. Again, he was such a negative presence in the office that most people didn't think twice about him being gone, but it haunted me for a while. Hell, It still does. Not that he's dead, but that in the dreams, I could see his humanity and the terror of his face. Nothing will humanize an enemy quite like seeing them have to face up to death, I guess. The dreams continue, but none of them have featured the monster again, and I really hope it stays that way.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.